All right, welcome back, everybody. We're moving on to Module 2.3, Community Ecology. So in our previous lecture, we were looking specifically at population ecology and a lot of the terms that we use to describe populations. And today we're going to be moving on to sort of the next larger layer of ecology, which is community ecology. So that's really looking at how different populations interact with one another and the vocabulary that ecologists use to describe those communities. So our key questions for this lecture are to understand first, what is a keystone species in a community? And we have an additional video I'd like you to watch that looks at trophic cascades and keystone species, and specifically it's going to look at the sea otter as a example of a keystone species. Secondly, we're going to look at food chains and food webs and how does energy flow through them. This is probably something that you've encountered before, but what we're going to be specifically looking at is understanding these interactions and how community ecologists tend to classify and talk about food chains and food webs. Lastly, we're going to be talking about symbiosis, and we're going to understand how community ecologists talk about positive and negative interactions among and within members of a community. So in your book this week, the keystone species that the book uses as an example are honeybees. You've probably heard, just in general, there's been several really good documentaries looking at the importance of the honeybee and particularly how the populations of honeybees influence other communities. So when we have something, a species in which So when we have a species which other species rely on for its survival, and there are several downstream effects of the removal of the species, that's what we refer to as a keystone. And so this is just a diagram looking at basically if you remove the bee, all these other consumers and producers start to fall because they are reliant on the pollination from honeybees. So your book gives an example of different types of plants that honeybees pollinate. You can see that there are some plants where bees don't play a large role in pollination, but there are some species such as almonds, apples, and blueberries which are almost exclusively pollinated by honeybees. So if we have a honeybee eliminated from the population, we're likely not to be able to have almonds, apples, and blueberries as part of our food system. So, and that's really where I would want you to sort of focus is, okay, so if I start to remove one species, how does that directly affect a larger system? And that's really what community ecology is about, is understanding the interaction between one type of population and another type of population. So one of the easiest ways to start thinking about how populations interact is through trophic levels or through food chains. So a trophic level is basically just feeding levels based on positions in a food chain. Trophic comes from the Greek trophe, meaning nutrients. And so at the very bottom of all food chains, we have something that we call producers, or we call them autotrophs. Autotrophs come from two Greek roots, auto, meaning self, and trophic, meaning nutrients. So we have self-nutrients. So these are going to be organisms that produce their own energy. So, for example, we have at the bottom, we have blueberries. Blueberries get their energy from the sun, which is converted through photosynthesis and creates glucose. Glucose being the primary sugar or nutrient that is then passed up this food chain. So going up this food chain or food pyramid, we have mice. Now mice are what we would consider a heterotroph. So rather than autotroph, we have heterotroph. Hetero meaning other, and trophe again meaning nutrients. So needing others for nutrients. Now mice are what we consider primary autotrophs or herbivores, or primary consumers, in which they require producers in order to survive. However, critically, as we start thinking about rather than just this basic definition of one thing eats another thing, is we really want to focus on how energy is actually moving up this food chain. So while blueberries at this bottom are producing 100% of that energy, only about 10% of that energy can be passed on to the mouse, because the vast majority of it, about 90%, is lost through heat and respiration. And that continues up the food chain. So at the very top of this food chain, we have a hawk, which would be our secondary consumer. So at the top of this food chain, we have our secondary consumer, because they feed off mice, which in turn feeds off our initial producer. However, again, we have this 10% loss of energy from one level to the next. So really, the hawk is only able to consume about 1% of the total energy that is initially produced by the producers at the bottom of the food chain. And this is one of the early hypotheses as to why there are so many producers and so few secondary carnivores, because again, this energy transfer, you're getting so much energy lost between each of these levels. However, the reality is it's very rare in nature to have a very basic food pyramid just like this. In reality, we have something that is much more complex. We have a food web, which is really telling us about the interconnections between different populations. For example, in our previous slide, hawks don't exclusively prey on mice. They might eat other voles or other small mammals. So they're not 100% dependent on the trophic level below them. And that's what ecologists sort of like to think of when we're looking at food webs. This is showing all the different options that exist between the different levels. So we have butterflies, which then can be consumed by higher level predators such as birds. And you see how, again, the honeybee is at the center of this food web, because if you remove this food web, if you remove honeybees, you can see all the downstream effects that occur when honeybees are removed from this complex food web. And again, with food webs, we still have that loss, that energy loss from level to level. So always be thinking about not necessarily that food webs exist. You probably all know that food webs exist. But I want you to think instead in terms of overall energy expenditure between these levels. Because that's really at the heart of what allows a community to survive, is the amount of energy they are able to consume. Now, ultimately, when you start looking at these food webs, you come across inevitably habitat and conservation and sorry, there was some technical difficulties there. So ultimately, when you start exploring these food webs, you come across inevitably this idea of competing for resources and understanding where a species fits in terms of the space, environmental conditions, and resources that a species needs to survive and reproduce. And that concept is called a niche or niche. Um, so that's where we're going to pick up in our next lecture. See you soon.